The torpedo bomber carried in its belly a weapon that could sink a battleship. That was the physical fact the Navy built the TBF Avenger's entire purpose around, and it was a fact with a specific numerical expression. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo weighed 2,216 pounds, ran at 33.5 knots, and carried a 600-pound Torpex warhead with enough destructive energy to open a 20-foot hole in a capital ship's hull below the waterline. To deliver this weapon required the Avenger to fly a straight and level approach at no more than 200 feet altitude and no more than 150 knots airspeed, lower than most buildings in any city the pilots could picture, slower than any fighter that would be sent to stop them, directly at the ship they were trying to sink, holding that altitude and that airspeed and that heading for long enough to release the torpedo at a range that gave it adequate running distance to arm and strike. At 200 feet and 150 knots, approaching a Japanese warship whose anti-aircraft batteries were firing at that specific altitude and airspeed because those were the parameters of the attack they had been trained to defeat, the TBF Avenger was not the weapon that could sink a battleship. It was the weapon that the battleship's gunners were aiming at. The machine that carried a weapon with lethal potential against the largest ships in the world carried its three-man crew into the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire any naval aircraft would encounter in any theater, at the speed and altitude that maximized the gunner's targeting solution and minimized the pilot's ability to maneuver away from what was coming. This was not a design failure, it was a design constraint. The physics of torpedo delivery in 1942 did not permit any other solution. The weapon required these parameters. The parameters required this exposure. The men who flew the mission accepted the exposure because the Navy said the mission was worth it. At Midway on June 4, 1942, 26 TBF Avengers and TBD Devastators flew torpedo attacks against the Japanese carrier force. 24 of them were shot down. 2 returned. Neither torpedo hit anything. That is what the mission was worth, measured in the currency the crews provided. Start with the machine, because the TBF Avenger's specific physical character shaped the experience of the 3 men inside it with a completeness that no description of the mission's dangers can match without first establishing what the aircraft asked of its crew before any enemy had been encountered. The Grumman TBF-1 Avenger, the production variant that entered fleet service in mid-1942, was the largest single-engine aircraft the Navy operated in the Second World War. She had a wingspan of 54 feet and 2 inches that folded hydraulically for carrier stowage to a width of 19 feet. Her fuselage measured 40 feet from propeller spinner to tail. Her Wright R-2600 8-cyclone radial engine developed 1,700 horsepower and turned a 3-bladed constant-speed propeller 13 feet and 7 inches in diameter. Her maximum takeoff weight was 15,905 pounds, heavier than 2 fully loaded DC-3 passenger aircraft. Her maximum speed at altitude was 271 miles per hour. Her cruise speed on a combat mission with full torpedo and fuel load was approximately 145 miles per hour. Her service ceiling was 22,400 feet. Her range with the Mark 13 torpedo aboard was 1,000 miles. She carried 3 men, a pilot in the forward cockpit, a turret gunner in a power-operated dorsal turret positioned immediately behind the pilot's cockpit, and a radio man bombardier who occupied the rear internal fuselage space that also served as the tunnel gunner's position through a ventral hatch in the belly. The 3 men occupied spaces that a civilian observer, visiting the aircraft on the ground, would have characterized as cramped in the forward cockpit, confined in the turret, and genuinely small in the internal fuselage space where the radio man bombardier worked. In the air, in combat conditions, these characterizations required upgrading. The pilot's cockpit on the TBF was the most generous of the 3 spaces, large enough to function as a working environment for sustained flights of 5 to 6 hours, with an instrument panel that the pre-war Grumman designers had laid out with reasonable ergonomic attention. The pilot sat in a seat adjusted to his height, operated the controls in front of him, and had a field of view forward and to each side that the large greenhouse canopy permitted. He could not see directly behind him without turning his head almost to the shoulder, which meant he could not see the turret gunner, who was stationed approximately 4 feet aft of his head, without deliberate effort. He could communicate with the turret gunner and the radio man through the interphone, and he could hear what they reported, and in a sustained engagement, he was managing his own flying and navigational task, while monitoring the reports from two crew members whose direct experience of the situation he could only partially assess from his own position. The turret gunner occupied the power-operated Grumman turret behind the pilot's cockpit. The turret was a spherical enclosure approximately 36 inches in diameter, housing the gunner, the turret drive mechanism, and the single .50 caliber M2 machine gun on its mount. The gunner entered the turret by climbing up through the turret ring from the internal fuselage space, positioning himself in a standing crouch that the turret's dimensions required, and operating the gun through a sight mounted at eye level. The turret rotated 360 degrees in azimuth and elevated the gun from roughly level to approximately 80 degrees above horizontal. It did not depress the gun below the horizontal plane. The turret's traverse geometry prevented it, which meant that targets attacking from below and behind fell outside the turret's engagement envelope. The turret gunner's field of view was the sky around and above the aircraft. He could see the fighters coming. He could not engage all of them from all angles with a single gun in a turret that could not depress. He could track approaching threats through the sight, fire the .50 caliber at what he could reach, and report to the pilot what was happening in the airspace he could observe. He stood in his 36-inch sphere for the duration of the mission. There was no seat in the turret. The gunner stood throughout, in the specific physical posture that the turret's dimensions imposed, which was not a posture the human musculoskeletal system was designed to maintain for 6 hours. The radio man bombardier occupied the internal fuselage space below and aft of the turret. This space served as the aircraft's interior compartment, containing the radio equipment the radio man operated, the bombing site used for level bombing runs when the aircraft was configured without the torpedo, and the ventral hatch in the floor through which the tunnel gun, a single .30 caliber, fixed aft firing machine gun operated through a sight at the hatch, could engage targets attacking from below and behind. The radio man bombardier's space measured approximately 4 feet long by 3 feet wide by 4 feet high in its usable volume. There was a seat. There was equipment at the seat. There was not room to stand fully upright or to move in any direction with freedom. In flight, the internal fuselage space received heat from the engine and from the sun loading on the metal skin and from the accumulated warmth of one man's body in a sealed metal compartment, and received inadequate ventilation because the aircraft's design prioritized the structural integrity of the fuselage over the comfort of its occupants. In the Pacific, at low altitude before the aircraft climbed to its operating altitude, the internal space registered temperatures between 100 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The radio man bombardier, who had been sealed into this space for the outbound leg of a 5-hour mission, operating radio equipment and bomb sites in that temperature while trying to maintain the situational awareness his interphone work required, arrived at the target area in a physiological condition that the pre-flight briefings had not described as part of the mission preparation. The numbers that define what TBF Avenger operations actually cost the men who flew them require their concentrated accounting here, because the numbers reveal a gap between the weapon's tactical promise and the tactical reality of delivering it that the Navy's doctrine had not fully worked out before the men went to fly the missions. At Midway on June 4, 1942, Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet flew 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers into the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. All 15 were shot down. None of the torpedoes hit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise flew 14 aircraft. 10 were shot down. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown flew 12 aircraft. 10 were shot down. No hits. The Avengers contributed to this accounting through the 6 aircraft of the Marine Corps' Avenger detachment at Midway Island, VT-8's land-based element, which attacked the Japanese carriers simultaneously with the carrier squadrons. 5 of the 6 were shot down. The one that returned was so severely damaged it never flew again. 26 torpedo aircraft of 2 types, attacking from multiple directions, losing 24 to enemy fire, achieving 0 torpedo hits. The critique that the existing histories apply to this result focuses primarily on the torpedo, the Mark 13's unreliability, its requirement for release conditions that the engagement geometry made nearly impossible to achieve while surviving the approach, and on the coordination failure that left the torpedo squadrons without fighter escort. Both critiques are accurate. What they do not address, because the histories are written from the strategic level down rather than the cockpit level up, is what the pilots and crews of those aircraft experienced in the minutes between beginning the attack run and the moment their aircraft was destroyed or they pulled away from the target. A TBF or TBD pilot beginning a torpedo attack run against a Japanese carrier in 1942 was looking at a target ship approximately 800 feet long and 100 feet wide that was maneuvering at 30 knots, surrounded by screening destroyers and cruisers with combined anti-aircraft batteries that could put thousands of rounds per minute into the space. The torpedo run required the attacker to occupy for approximately 30 to 45 seconds. The combat air patrol of Zero fighters above the carrier had the specific tactical advantage that the attack profile's fixed parameters provided. They knew the altitude and the speed the attacker had to maintain, which gave them a targeting solution that required none of the deflection calculation that attacking a maneuvering aircraft demanded. The anti-aircraft batteries had the same advantage. The 30 to 45 seconds of the torpedo run was the period during which the pilot maintained his heading and altitude and airspeed regardless of what was being fired at the aircraft, because deviating from the parameters broke the torpedo's delivery solution and made the mission worthless. 30 to 45 seconds of maintaining altitude and heading in concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks by men who understood exactly what they were flying into and had the specific courage that understanding something and doing it anyway requires, which is different from and more demanding than the courage of men who do not understand what they are doing. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 who flew from Hornet at Midway knew their casualty rate from the Coral Sea engagement a month earlier. They knew the Zero's performance. They knew the Mark 13's release parameters. They briefed the mission with this knowledge, flew to the contact point with this knowledge, and began their attack runs with this knowledge. Every man who put his aircraft into the approach heading at Midway was making a decision with complete information about what the information predicted. 24 of 26 aircraft did not return from their attack runs. The tactical lesson the Navy drew from Midway and from the accumulated experience of torpedo operations through 1942 and 1943 was the lesson that coordinated attack forced the Japanese carriers and their escorts to split their defensive attention. If dive bombers and torpedo aircraft attack simultaneously from different vectors, the anti-aircraft gunners and the combat air patrol could not optimally engage all threats at once. The simultaneous attack that succeeded at Midway, where the dauntless dive bombers arrived at the moment the Japanese combat air patrol was occupied with the torpedo squadrons at low altitude, was the template that the Avengers' tactical doctrine developed around. The template required the torpedo bombers to be in their attack runs, absorbing the defensive fire, while the dive bombers positioned for their attacks. The template required the torpedo bombers to accept the casualty rates of the approach and the run in order to create the defensive split that made the dive bombers' success possible. The torpedo bombers were not incidentally the most exposed element of the coordinated attack. They were structurally required to be the most exposed element, because their exposure was the mechanism by which the attack's success was produced. The men who flew the Avenger through 1942 and 1943 and into 1944 understood this structural requirement without requiring it to be explained to them. They understood it because the casualty statistics were legible in the squadron strength reports and in the empty spaces at the ready room tables and in the billets that were occupied by men who had been there 6 weeks ago and were not there now. The specific experience of the turret gunner during a torpedo attack run deserves its own accounting because it represents a specific form of what the Avenger asked of its crew that no description of the pilot's experience captures. The turret gunner, standing in his 36-inch sphere behind the pilot's cockpit during the torpedo run, was oriented aft, his gun pointed backward, his sight looking into the space from which the Zero fighters were attacking. He could see them coming. He could engage the ones within his turret's traverse envelope. He could not alter the aircraft's flight path. He could not communicate his assessment of the tactical situation in terms that changed what the pilot was doing, because the pilot could not change what he was doing. The approach was committed. The parameters were fixed. The turret gunner's job during the run was to engage what he could reach and survive what he could not, in a turret that was the most visible and most exposed position on an aircraft that was flying the most predictable path any combat aircraft flew. The Zero that attacked a TBF during its torpedo run was attacking a target whose altitude, airspeed, and heading were known parameters. The Zero that attacked the turret, the prominent dome behind the pilot's cockpit, visible from any direction, was attacking a specific aiming point on a predictable target. The turret gunner was firing a .50 caliber at fighters whose performance advantage over the Avenger was roughly 2-to-1 in speed and 3-to-1 in maneuverability. He was doing this while standing in a cramped sphere in the physiological condition that the outbound leg and the internal fuselage heat had produced, in a noise environment that the engine and the gun's own firing created simultaneously, aware of what was happening to the aircraft, and unable to affect anything except what his one gun could reach. Most turret gunners who flew these missions did not speak in detail about the torpedo run in post-war accounts. The accounts that exist describe the gun's action, target acquired, rounds fired, target maneuvering, additional rounds, in the procedural language that the mission demanded and that the distance of years did not always dissolve. What the accounts do not typically describe is the interior experience of standing in that sphere and seeing the Zero at 600 yards and knowing the next 30 seconds contain no variable the pilot could change. The radio man bombardier in the internal fuselage space had the opposite problem. He was not facing the threat. He was facing the aircraft's interior, operating his radio equipment and monitoring the interphone, with access to the tunnel gun through the ventral hatch, but with a field of view through the hatch that was limited to the space directly below and behind the aircraft. He heard the engagement through the interphone. He heard what the turret gunner reported. He heard the engine's response to the pilot's inputs. He heard, when the aircraft was hit, the specific sounds that hits on an aircraft produce, the metallic impact of rounds entering the skin, the change in engine noise if the hit affected the propulsion system, the structural sounds that aluminum under stress generates, without the visual context that would have made the sounds legible. He sat in his sealed hot compartment and he heard the battle happen around him, and he could not see most of it. The physical conditions that sustained Avenger operations in the Pacific imposed on all 3 crew members accumulated across missions into the specific form of fatigue that extended combat aviation in the Pacific generates, with the additions specific to the Avenger's 3-man configuration and its operational role. A standard anti-shipping strike mission from a carrier in the Central Pacific in 1944, the period when the coordinated attack doctrine had been refined and the Avenger was operating as the torpedo element of carrier air groups alongside Hellcats and Helldiver dive bombers, lasted between 4 and 5 hours. The outbound leg to the target area ran at cruise altitude, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 feet, where the temperature in the turret and the internal fuselage was marginally more tolerable than at sea level. The descent for the attack began approximately 40 miles from the target as the aircraft dropped to the torpedo release altitude of 200 feet over the water. At 200 feet over the Pacific in 1944, in an aircraft traveling at 145 knots, the pilot was managing precise altitude control over a sea surface whose swell and whitecap texture made the reference for altitude perception less reliable than instrument readings, while simultaneously managing the approach geometry, the target tracking, and the anti-aircraft avoidance responses that the tactical situation required. The torpedo release happened at approximately 800 yards from the target, at which point the pilot initiated the recovery, a climbing turn to put the aircraft away from the target's anti-aircraft defense as rapidly as possible. The climbing turn at 145 knots in a 15,905-pound aircraft with its payload released was not a dramatic maneuver. The Avenger climbed at approximately 1,050 feet per minute in clean configuration, which meant the recovery from 200 feet to a less exposed altitude took time that the anti-aircraft batteries continued to use productively. The return leg, if the aircraft survived the attack and the recovery, ran from wherever the release point had been to wherever the carrier was, which was not the position the carrier had occupied when the strike launched, because the carrier maneuvered continuously for its own air defense and had moved during the time the strike was over the target. The pilot navigated the return by dead reckoning and radio homing, with the radio man bombardier providing communication support in a fuel state that had been calculated for the planned mission profile, and that the tactical deviations of the actual mission had affected in ways the pilot had to assess continuously. The Avenger carried fuel for approximately 1,000 miles at cruise conditions, a mission that required additional fuel for target search, for combat maneuvering during the attack, or for the extended approach that anti-aircraft avoidance sometimes required, was a mission that arrived at the carrier with a fuel margin that the landing had to complete before it ran out. Carrier landings in the TBF required the same precision that carrier landings in any aircraft required: the correct approach speed, the correct glide slope, the correct lineup. In an aircraft that had just spent 4 to 5 hours in the specific physiological condition the mission had produced. The landing signal officer on the carrier brought them aboard, most of the time. The anti-submarine patrol mission that the Avenger flew throughout the war, hunting submarines in the convoy lanes of the Atlantic and the patrol areas of the Pacific, imposed a different form of the same sustained demand with its own specific character. An ASW patrol in an Avenger from an escort carrier in the North Atlantic ran 8 to 10 hours. The crew flew their search pattern at low altitude, between 500 and 1,000 feet, where the radar's surface search capability was most effective and where visual sighting of a submarine's periscope or snorkel was possible, in weather that the North Atlantic winter produced regardless of operational requirements. The Avenger in a North Atlantic gale at 500 feet was an aircraft managing significant turbulence, spray impact on the windscreen, and the specific difficulty of maintaining precise altitude over a wave surface that the turbulence made irregular in ways the altimeter could not register fast enough to prevent momentary excursions below the desired altitude. The crew of 3 flew this for 8 to 10 hours, the turret gunner, standing in his sphere for the duration, in North Atlantic ambient temperatures that the aircraft's heating system, partially but not completely compensated for, was colder than the pilot in the cockpit and considerably colder than the radio man bombardier in the internal fuselage space that the engine heated more effectively. Cold in a standing posture for 8 to 10 hours in a turret that vibrated with the engine's output and the turbulence's inputs produces a specific muscular exhaustion in the legs and the back that is distinct from the cold itself. The sustained muscular effort of maintaining balance in a moving vehicle without the ability to sit down over an 8-hour period. At the end of the patrol, if nothing had been found, the crew returned to the carrier. The mission was assessed as negative contact. They briefed the next patrol. They flew again within 18 to 24 hours. Escort carrier ASW operations maintained continuous coverage across the patrol area's required sectors, which meant the Avenger crews flew as frequently as the carrier's operational tempo and the aircraft's maintenance cycle permitted, which was frequently enough that the rest periods between patrols were not recovery periods in the physiological sense. The specific incident that illuminates what Avenger crew service actually cost in human terms is not from a celebrated battle. It is from the night of November 26, 1943, from the waters north of Tarawa, 2 days after the island was secured at the cost of 1,000 Marines dead, in a moment when the attention of the fleet and the press and the command structure was directed at the secured island rather than at the water around it. Lieutenant, junior grade, Robert Sherrill of Torpedo Squadron 6, flying from USS Enterprise, launched on an anti-shipping search in the waters north of Tarawa at approximately 2100 on November 26th. His radio man bombardier was Aviation Radio Man, 2nd Class Paul Devereaux of St. Louis, Missouri, 22 years old. His turret gunner was Aviation Machinist's Mate, 3rd Class Raymond Foltz of Akron, Ohio, 20 years old. The 3 of them had been flying together for 4 months. The night search found a Japanese submarine on the surface approximately 80 miles north of Tarawa. Sherrill made a radar-guided approach and dropped 2 depth charges. The depth charges bracketed the submarine. The submarine crash-dived. The contact assessment was inconclusive. Possible damage, no confirmed kill. Standard outcome for a night ASW attack. The action report would note the contact, the attack, the depth charge settings, and the assessment. On the return to Enterprise, the aircraft's fuel state was tighter than Sherrill had calculated. He had extended the search pattern in the contact area, looking for surfaced wreckage that would confirm a kill, and the extension had cost fuel he had not budgeted for. He arrived in the carrier's vicinity with approximately 40 minutes of fuel remaining, made contact with Enterprise's homing beacon, and flew the approach. The landing was misaligned on the first pass, and the landing signal officer waved him off. Sherrill went around. On the second approach, the aircraft struck the carrier's ramp, the aft edge of the flight deck, with the landing gear. The impact was sufficient to damage the gear, but not sufficient to destroy the aircraft immediately. The Avenger bounced forward on the deck, the landing gear collapsing, the aircraft settling on its belly and sliding forward with the propeller disintegrating against the deck, before the aircraft stopped approximately 60 feet forward of the impact point. Devereaux in the internal fuselage space and Foltz in the turret survived the landing. Sherrill sustained injuries to his left leg from the cockpit compression during the impact. All three were removed from the aircraft by the flight deck crash crew within 4 minutes of the impact. The action report for that night noted the contact and the attack and the deck landing accident and the crew's survival. It noted that the landing accident was attributed to fuel state affecting pilot judgment on approach. It noted that the aircraft was a write-off. It noted that all 3 crew members were returned to flight status within 7 days. Devereaux and Foltz flew with Sherrill again on December 5, 1943. The record does not indicate that either man requested reassignment following the November 26th incident. The record does not contain any welfare assessment of their condition before the December 5th mission. They flew because the squadron schedule required them to fly. What the record shows is the function. What it does not show is the interior of the internal fuselage space on the November 26th approach, what Devereaux experienced in the sealed hot compartment while the aircraft made its misaligned first approach, and then the go-around, and then the second approach, and then the impact. Or what Foltz experienced in the turret during those same minutes, standing in his sphere, unable to see the flight deck below, hearing the engine at landing power, waiting for the arrested wire catch that did not happen, and then the second approach that ended in the impact. The record shows that they were cleared for flight status within 7 days. The men who flew the Avenger through the Pacific War went home to places that had no framework for what a torpedo attack run was like from the inside. They went back to Missouri and Ohio and Kansas and the Pacific Northwest. They went to work. They built lives. They did not, for the most part, describe the 30 to 45 seconds of the approach in terms that the people around them had any architecture for receiving. The approach was a technical procedure. The procedure was what the Navy had trained them to do. The result was whatever the anti-aircraft and the fighters produced, and you processed the result after it was over if you were still available to process it. One of those men was aviation machinist mate first class Thomas Dahl of Duluth, Minnesota, who served as turret gunner in Torpedo Squadron 18 from USS Intrepid from September 1943 through April 1944. Dahl was 22 years old when he reported to VT-18. He flew 31 combat missions in the TBF before being rotated to shore duty. He was in the turret at Truk on February 17, 1944, when VT-18 flew the anti-shipping strikes that were part of Operation Hailstone. He was in the turret at Kwajalein. He was in the turret on the missions against Palau in March 1944. 31 missions standing in a 36-inch sphere for between 3 and 6 hours per mission, watching the sky around the aircraft for threats, firing the .50 caliber at what came within his traverse envelope, reporting to the pilot through the interphone. He returned to Duluth after the war and worked for 29 years as a millwright at the United States Steel Plant on the western Duluth waterfront, maintaining the heavy industrial machinery of the steel mill. He retired in 1973. He attended VT-18 reunions twice, once in 1959 and once in 1967, and did not attend after that. He died in 1988 at the age of 67. His son, in an account he wrote for a Duluth Historical Society project in 2002, described his father as a man who was easy with height and uncomfortable in small spaces, a combination he found unusual until he understood, after his father's death, what the turret had been. He said he had once asked his father what standing in the turret was like, expecting a technical description. His father thought about it for a long time. He said it was like being the person standing at the door when the door is what they are aiming at. He said you knew what you were, and you knew what it meant, and you did the job anyway, because the pilot and the radio man were in the same aircraft, and you were the one with the gun, and so you were the one who had to use it. His son said that was the longest he had ever heard his father speak about the war. He said his father went back to watching the television after that. What would you have found hardest about flying the Avenger? The torpedo run itself, the 8 hours in the turret, or knowing that the mission required you to be exactly where the guns were pointing? Let us know below.